It's not calling us to go to street preaching. I've done this with atheists. I've done this with Hindus. Our role is not to convince people. So don't give up. Don't get discouraged. You don't know what God will do. Again, when we look at the Good Shepherd, what we see is that this is a call to go into the world and to reach people where they're at. A lot of churches, it can be common, that we can limit our evangelistic efforts to saying, hey, we're going to build the church and we're going to preach the gospel and people can come to us and we're going to tell them about Jesus when they come to us. Or as individuals, we're going to, hey, I'm going to live my Christian life and if you want to know about Jesus, you can come and ask me. Now, I ran across this T-shirt. I'm going to have to read it to you. I hope it's meant in humor. It says this: hello, I would like to invite you to church, but I'm terribly uncomfortable doing this. Would you do me a favor and ask me about church? Thank you. I think, you look at that and I said, that's where some of us may be at. We're kind of like, well, I don't want to do that, but I'll tell you as soon as you ask me. And I think our approach can be like Little Bo Peep. And we all know the story of Little Bo Peep. And too many churches, too many Christians, we can be Little Bo Peep. And it's the approach that we see in the little poem. Little Bo Peep has lost their sheep and doesn't know where to find them. Leave them alone, and they'll come home wagging their tails behind them. And so a lot of times we could say, okay, well, I've lost my sheep. And okay, if when your life's broken, when your tail's wagging, come home and we'll tell you about Jesus. When your life is broken, come and ask me and I'll tell you about Jesus. I'll tell you about the hope that I have. And we don't go to the world. And that's what we sometimes do. I'm going to live my testimony silently before other people and just somebody can come and ask. Now let me ask you, some of us, we've done that. I live my testimony. I'm willing to share with anybody that asks. How many have testimonies of people that have come and asked you? How many success stories do we have with that? Not a whole lot, because that's not the biblical model. Little Bo Peep isn't in the Bible. The Good Shepherd is in the Bible. The model is a totally different thing, where the Good Shepherd left the comfort of the fold. He left the other sheep and he goes out into the wilds. He goes out into the rocks and he finds the sheep where he's at, the one that's lost. And when we look at that, there's things in ministry that we do that I love that, the Bible club that we do. That's great that we get to go into the school and we get to preach the gospel there. We meet people where they're at. That's wonderful. But practically, even as individuals, what is God calling us to do? There might be things like that. It's not calling us to go to street preaching. It's not calling us to go accost people, strangers on an elevator. What it's mainly doing is it's calling us to build relationships with unbelieving friends and look for opportunities to share our faith. And when I talk about building relationships, it's not just, okay, let me find an unbeliever and get together and just share the gospel, and if you're not open, I'm going to write you off. No, it's actually building a relationship where we care about the person, where we, over time, build trust, where we care about them because God cares about them. I had a personal story that just illustrated some of the problems with what can happen. There's somebody that God had brought me into my life, and I built a friendship with this person. And over time, he was an avowed atheist. And so over time, I built relationship. And we just get together and we talk about minimal spiritual things at first. And I remember one day, we had lunch and we're walking out. And he says, Mike, you're different than most Christians I know. He says, most Christians, they get together with me and they try to tell me about Jesus. I tell them I'm not interested, and I never see him again. But you're my friend. And the fact is that I was his friend, and it was over that period of time of a long friendship that over years it started to open up the door to share the gospel. And that's what God has called us to do for. If Jesus really cares about the sheep, then we're to be like Jesus, and we're to commit ourselves to relationships with people where we commit to them, we care about them. It's been said that people will never care to know what you know until they first know how much you care. And that's true, that we've got this relationship, we care, that we spend time. And that's the example of Jesus. It's a good shepherd. In fact, if you go to Luke chapter 15, same parable, but look at how it's set up. In Luke 15, the setup is this. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So he told them this parable, and then we get into good shepherd. And the context is that Jesus is so intentional about seeking relationships with unbelievers. The religious people are complaining against him. He's a friend of sinners. And Jesus said, yeah, that's right. And again, if I have the heart of Jesus, then I need to do more of that. Now, what is then my role in what God is calling me to here? Because I will tell you, this is a miracle. This is something that ultimately, if we seek to lead people to Jesus, that is a miracle. When someone comes to Christ, God changes their heart. I cannot do that. It's a miracle, but yet God calls me to play a role. And if I don't understand what my role is and what my role isn't, it can lead to a lot of confusion and a lot of frustration. So let me start by saying what our role is. God calls us to play a role. He's teaching this parable, the Good Shepherd, in the context of saying, this is what it means to be great. Invest yourselves in people that have nothing to offer you in return. Invest yourselves in unbelievers, that they're not necessarily the people that you would choose for because you enjoy the most, but invest in relationships. We're called, it talks about in Thessalonians, that we're called to be ambassadors for Christ. We're called to represent Him, both in our word and our deed. And both things go together. The fact is that if I'm sharing the word, but my life doesn't match up, then whatever I'm saying and my words are undermined by my actions. But on the other hand, I also have to speak. Francis of Assisi, he had a famous quote. He said, preach the word at all times. When necessary, use words. And that's great. There's great truth in that. So I preach at all times by my word, but when necessary, use words. And the fact is, at times, it will always become necessary. I cannot just live my life without giving a reason, without explaining. Look what it says in Romans 10. How will they then call on Him whom they've not believed? And how are they to believe in Him of whom they've not heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? That's not preaching up here, it's sharing. And the fact is, people won't believe unless somebody tells them. It continues in verse 17. So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. Faith comes by you hear certain things. And we are the representatives to share that word of Christ. And if we don't share it, they'll never believe. So we have a role. Now, it could be something as simple as, we're going to give one specific idea in a moment, but it's also a simple way of sometimes inviting people to church is a role. But inviting in church is a relationship. It's not going into a stranger, it's building the relationship. I'll give you a good example of this. Many of you might know Billy Graham, considered greatest evangelist of, the later half of the 1900s, or 1900s. And, we see these stories of thousands of people coming to these crusades and coming to Christ, and it's awesome. Do you know what actually happened in Billy Graham's crusades? What he would say was the effect of that? It wasn't like he set up shop and said, hey, unbelievers come, and you had a bunch of unbelievers said, I need that, and they showed up as crusades. That didn't happen. You know what would happen? Is he would go to a city, they would have their team go to a city a year beforehand, work with churches, and then in the churches they would challenge people with what they called Operation Andrew. Andrew in the Bible is the disciple who brought his brother to Jesus. And so they would, for a year, challenge individuals to say, think of 3 people in your life and pray for them regularly, build a relationship so that at the end of the year you have enough relationship built in so that you can invite them to the Graham Crusade. Now, when they came to the Graham Crusade and came forward, was it Billy Graham's preaching? I want to tell you, the people that were building the relationships did 95% of the work. It was relationships. Even with Billy Graham, the unbelievers don't just show up for that. And so the same thing is true for us. And it could be inviting that person, but it's building the relationship. And that's why we have not only church, but we have, numerous events that are kind of seeker opportunities and conferences and women's events and men's events that just come and invite them into relationship. So we do have a role, but we also need to realize what our role isn't. Our role is not to convince people. Our role is not to change people. It's not to save people. See, the fact is, at the end of the day, only the Holy Spirit can change somebody's heart. God uses the word, but God uses the word. God does it. It's a seed. When the Bible talks in agricultural ideas, we can plant the seed, but I can't make the seed grow. But the seed isn't going to grow without me planting the seed. God does the miracle. And so I can't convince someone. Now, that's a big load off our concern. You know why? Because if I think that I can, then I'm going to be like, I don't know all the right answers, and I don't know what to say. You don't need to know all the right answers. God uses imperfect people. He uses, a lot of times the most effective evangelists are new believers who know nothing other than God saved me. Come and see Jesus. And we don't need to know all the right answers. You just need to be faithful, because it isn't us that convinces. It's us that represent Christ, and it's God that does a miracle. It's not our role to necessarily get someone to pray the prayer of salvation. Well, isn't that the goal? Well, yeah, it is. But again, use the imagery of the harvest. You plant a seed, you water it, it takes a long time, and at only the very end do we harvest it. And so if we're building a relationship, a lot of times I might take someone who's come and I share the gospel, I try to build a relationship with, and it may take time, it may take months, it may take years. And if they're not open, that doesn't mean it failed. It just is, well, I'm just planting the seed. And sometimes you have people that are most hostile, most negative. That might be a sign of God opening their heart. Why? Because why they're hostile? Because there's something that's sensitive there. God's word is pricking at a sensitive spot, and they're rejecting against it. But the reality is that's a sign that God's working. So don't give up. Don't get discouraged. You don't know what God will do. Go in humble confidence, because God will do the miracle. So let me just give some practical how-tos. What do we do here? If it's just some, I want to turn this into just a general to say, okay, what is our role? Again, first of all, if you don't have this relationship with Christ, He's pursued you. He wants a relationship with you. First of all, come and know Him first. For those who have that relationship, here's what I want you to do. First of all, identify 3, I'm going to call lost sheep that God has put in your life. God hasn't called us to save the world. Think of 3 unbelieving family, friends that He's played on your heart. And you might even be praying. You might, in this time, God, who are people that are in my sphere of influence you want me to pray for? He wants you to reach the sphere of influence. And some of it, when you look at the Good Shepherd noticed the one who wandered away. See, and that's what we're called to do. We're called to look at the one who wandered away. We're called to find a few people in our sphere of influence. These are the people that God has put in my life that I want to notice, that I want to specifically pray for, that I want to focus. Because if it's just like, God, use me, probably nothing's going to happen. It starts to happen when I start to focus on a few people that God has put in my life. And then, I want to challenge you to commit to pray regularly for their salvation. Again, realize there's not anything that you can do. It's a miracle of God, but God uses you. And so you pray that God would do the miracle. And here's what you've got to see is that God uses prayer to do miracles. And the fact is that, I've talked over the years, multiple people that have prayed regularly, and it's amazing how often God answers those prayers. People come to know Christ. And so I'm going to ask you to pray regularly, ideally daily, but even if not that, just several times a week. And God will work in that. God will do some amazing things. I want you to commit to pray regularly for them, and then also pray and look for opportunities to share the gospel. And now this doesn't mean you go into the elevator and you say, okay, how do I do this? It's, you look for opportunities. Let me give you a very specific one, a really easy one, all right? Because most of us, I don't know what to say. This is what I use more than anything else. And I can tell you, no matter how closed and hostile to the gospel it is, this people will let you do this, right? Thinking these 3 people, and I just go to them and I say, how can I pray for you? And if you do that, then try to follow up in the next couple of weeks. I've been praying about that. How's that going? Now, I want to tell you, I've done this with atheists. I've done this with Hindus. I've done this with numerous people who have no faith in me. And I'll go to them and I say, I know you're an atheist and you don't believe in prayer and you don't think it does anything, but I do believe in prayer. It's a way that I can love you and serve you. So if you would just, kind of put up with me, if I could pray for you, how can I pray for you? And I want to tell you, I've had people, and they'll share like really empty and meaningless stuff, but I'll come back every couple of weeks. I've been praying about how that's going and how can I pray for you? And over time, they start to share real requests. And let me give you a true story of how this has worked. I remember one guy that was a Hindu. And again, he didn't believe. I know that, but I'm just saying, how can I pray for you? And one day, a couple of years into a relationship, he calls me out of the blue and he just says, man, I'm on this road and I just got cut off. I almost got killed. And the first person I thought of is to call you. I mean, literally, this 30 seconds, and it's like I almost got killed. And I think of the guy that prayed for me because suddenly I have a need and I'm going to go to the guy that has some kind of hotline to God. And then he called, and that started to open up a relationship with that next step where eventually he came to know Christ. And I encourage you to do that. Now, here's one last encouragement within this. Periodically, some of you have been here longer, you've heard me say this. I will say, think about 3 people that that God has placed on your heart. Commit to pray for them regularly. Pray for opportunities to share your faith. And commit to pray for them for 2 years. Now, I will have people come and say this to me. Most people will come when I say that and say, oh, I remember you said that before. I keep forgetting to do that. I need to do that. It's really important. That's what most people say. A few people will come up and say, I've been doing that. And every time that someone comes up and says, I've been doing that for the last couple of years, every time they would say, and one of them has come to know Christ. I've yet to have someone say, I've been praying for them for 2 years, and none of them has come to know Christ. I mean, the fact is, God works. God does amazing things. And I want to be a part of that. I want to be a part of what God is doing. I want to be I want to have the heart of the Good Shepherd. But it's easy to forget this. And that's where I've got to say, I'm not doing as well with this as I have in the past. And I need to be more intentional. We all need to be. We need to encourage each other in it. But there's nothing more wonderful than having the heart of the Good Shepherd and loving those who may not be the people that we would choose, but we're really intentional about saying, God, these are people that I want to invest in, that I want to love on. And then being a part of this story where we see God picking them up and the Good Shepherd and bringing them back home and being a part of that story. There's nothing more wonderful. And if we say, again, the whole thing is being great in the kingdom of God, I want to tell you, it's when I know that I was a part of leading someone to saving faith and that they're going to be in heaven for all eternity, in part because of the investment that I made in their life. There is no greater investment. There is nothing of greater significance that will live on for all eternity than that. And I don't know about you, but I love being a part of that. And all of us have a chance to be a part of that. And it's not, okay, you're going to lead hundreds of people to Christ. No, who are the few? Be faithful with the few and let God use you in the few, and you're going to be amazed at what God does. I hope as we begin this new year, you embrace this with me.